Elizabethan Poetry by Mattie Gross. The Elizabethan period flourished in the early 16th century. The poetry was written in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England. This time became known as the Golden Period in history of English literature. It was introduced by Sir Thomas Wyatt when he brought over the sonnet style from Italy. The characteristics of this poetry include romantic style and form. Most of the poetry was written of love or the world around us. The poetry was heavily influenced by neoclassicism, which is the Greek arts. All poetry is structured with strict meters and rhyme schemes. Three influential poets were Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, and William Shakespeare. Edmund was best known for his poem of the Faerie Queene. Marlowe was the foremost Elizabethan tragedian of his day. William Shakespeare was known as the greatest writer in the English language. William Shakespeare was an English poet, playwright, and actor, regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's preeminent dramatist. He is often called England's national poet.
Fear No More by William Shakespeare. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and taken thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. Fear no more the frown of the great, thou art past the tyrant's stroke. Care no more to clothe and eat. To thee the reed is as the oak, the sceptre, learning, physic, must all follow this and come to dust. Fear no more the lightning flash, nor the all dread thunderstone. Fear not slander, censure rash, thou hast finished joy and moan. All lovers young, all lovers must consign to thee and come to dust. No exorciser harm thee, nor no witchcraft charm thee. Ghost unlaid forbear thee, nothing ill come near thee. Quiet consummation have, and renowned be thy grave.
In Fear No More, Shakespeare is speaking from power. He is being comforting of death. The comfort comes from his own experiences and views of the world. The audience is intended for someone who is afraid of death or partaking in no longer living on this earth. The subject of Fear No More is the acceptance of death. He tries to convert the subject to be the acceptance. The theme is death, fear, and acceptance of the unknown.
Metaphysical poetry in the 1600s. Metaphysical poetry was founded in the 17th century by a man named Samuel Johnson, and it soon became known as one of the earliest forms of poetry. Johnson used this term in a book as he was writing about a few English poets. The literal translation of the word metaphysical is after the physical. As a whole, the term metaphysical deals with questions that can't be explained by science, and it questions the nature of reality in a philosophical way. There is no right or wrong answer to any metaphysical question. There are a few distinct characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Highly intellectualized, strange imagery, frequent paradox, and extremely complicated thought are all classifications of this 17th century poetry. It is oftentimes filled with wit and humor, even though the poets were examining serious questions. Metaphysical poetry sought to shock the reader and wake him or her up from normal existence. John Donne was one of the most prominent poets of this time. No Man is an Island was one of his best pieces. In this poem, he writes, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. The title of the poem and the first two lines are brought about to say that no man suffers alone. He implies that humans thrive upon others and no man can grow in isolation. In the following sentence, lines 3 through 4, he carries his thoughts forward to reiterate that humankind is a group in itself and that there is a common theme of suffering in everyone's lives. In lines 5 through 6, Donne uses Europe to show how we are dependent of others. He implies that Europe suffers when it loses even a small part. Later on in the poem, Donne says, "Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind." In this, there is a responsibility of one man for another that is implied. With no man existing alone, there is a community of man that shares in suffering. We are dependent on the lives of others. Perhaps the deepest meaning comes in the last lines of the poem. When Donne says, "Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee," he is using a metaphor of a church bell. He is relating this phrase to death and imagines himself passing his life on to the next. This leads him to a profound metaphysical realization of questions that cannot be answered.
Sorry for the party and the switch is smooth. No, really, I'm just...
Cavalier literary movement, or the CLM, occurred in the mid-1600s. To understand the CLM, it's good to understand the meaning of cavalier. Cavalier is showing arrogant or offhand regard, and it also means carefree or nonchalant. This really puts in perspective what the poets thought in this time. It is a movement of poetry that is straightforward and centered on romantic love and the idea of carpe diem, or to seize the day. It brought a new perspective to life. Instead of following strict moral code, most of the poets lived for the moment. The poetry was clear and non-figurative. Contrastly to the CLM, the metaphysical literary movement, which was overlapping in this time period, was centered around spirituality, science, and morality. The CLM also mirrored the Romanticism age as it viewed life through its pleasures of the moment and beauty. Some influential Cavalier poets in this time, also known as Royalists and members of the aristocracy, were Thomas Carew, Richard Lovelace, Robert Herrick, and John Suckling. They wrote in the 17th century and supported King Charles I during the English Civil War. Ben Jonson, who all of these said poets tried to emulate, was born around June 11, 1572. Ben Jonson was also the originator of Cavalier.
A Farewell to the World by Ben Jonson. False world, good night, since thou hast brought that hour upon my morn of age. Henceforth I quit thee from my thought, my part is ended on thy stage. Yes, threaten do. Alas, I fear as little as I hope from thee. I know thou canst not show nor bear more hatred than thou hast to me. My tender first and simple years thou didst abuse and then betray, since stirred stepped jealousies and fears when all the causes were away. Then in a soil hast planted me, where breathe the basest of thy fools, where envious arts professed be, and pride and ignorance the schools, where nothing is examined, weighed, but as 'tis rumoured, so believed, where every freedom is betrayed, and every goodness taxed or grieved. But what we are born for we must bear. Our frail condition it is such, that what to all may happen here, if 't chance to me, I must not grudge. Else I my state should much mistake, to harbour a divided thought from all my kind, that for my sake there should a miracle be wrought. No, I do know that I was born to age, misfortune, sickness, grief, but I will bear these with that scorn as shall not need thy false relief. Nor for my peace will I go far, as wanderers do that still do roam, but make my strengths, such as they are, here in my bosom and at home.
Ben Jonson starts his poem in all capital letters by saying, "False world, good night." To me, it emphasizes what the world has done to him. He is blaming the world for him wanting to kill himself. As a contemporary of Shakespeare, the last line of this first stanza, "My part is ended on thy stage," is showed in Shakespeare's quote, "All the world's stage and all the men and women merely players." In the second and third stanza, he is tempting the world. He is saying that he has no hope, but he is also not scared. He is saying he has gone through it all and the world hates him. In stanza 4 through 5, he is saying that the world has planted him in an awful environment where there's many fools and irrelevant schooling. He's saying that even all the great things are taxed and grieved, and everything is judged by what others rumor. In stanzas 6 and 7, after he is done complaining, he takes responsibility for his life. He speaks of the human condition and that it is normal for him to feel this way. He can't believe he could think of such a thought as killing himself. Later in stanza 8 through 9, he knows that humans were born for the bad in life to realize all of its goodness. He can handle it, though, as many Cavalier poets would, living day by day. He ends by asking for strength to keep going, and he decides not to take his life. Thank you for watching.
Hi, my name is Jake Routh, and this is Romanticism Poetry. Romanticism is poetry exploring the philosophical, literary, artistic, and cultural era reacting against prevailing Enlightenment ideals of the 19th century, providing themes dealing with nature, emotions, personal conflicts, and artistry. Some famous Romantic poets include William Blake, Lord Byron, John Keats, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Matthew Arnold, and John Clare. Percy Bysshe Shelley is the poet that I am explicating. Born on August 4th, 1792 in Field Place near Horsham, Sussex, England, Percy is the oldest son of Timothy and Elizabeth Shelley. He had 4 sisters and 1 brother. His grandfather possessed a seat in Parliament as well as a wealthy estate, which were both to be inherited by Percy. He attended Eton College for 6 years and later attended Oxford University. Shelley eloped at age 19 with Harriet Westbrook, who was 16 years old, and they eloped to Scotland. After they settled into the Lake District of England, Shelley began to write and publish some of his first works, including Queen Mab, a philosophical poem.
Love's Philosophy by Percy Bysshe Shelley. The fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single. All things by our Lord divine in one another's being mingle. Why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What are all these kissings worth, if thou kiss not me?
My explication of Love's Philosophy explores who is writing Love's Philosophy, and that is a man desperate to get with a specific woman. This man is saying, if all other forms of nature can mingle, what is stopping them from mingling? There's no location, but Shelley paints vivid pictures in the reader's imagination of the intermingling ways of nature. And Shelley is writing this poem to show that the man desires the woman, and he should get her because nature can interact with each other, and so should the people. The subject and theme of the poem. The theme is man and nature's relationship. The subject is, if man and nature can interact in such a beautiful way, then what is keeping man from interacting with a woman in the same way? A quote from the poem is, "See the mountains kiss high heaven," where he's explaining how the mountains kiss the high heavens, such as the clouds, so he should be able to kiss the woman he desires. Thank you for watching.
Pastoralism poetry, starting around 750 and 650 BC. Poetry. Pastoral, Latin for shepherd. Poetry represents society of shepherds being free from the complexities and corruption of city life. Pastoral poetry revolves around death, love, ideal life in the country, and mocking politics. The historical context of pastoral poetry. Pastoralism can be traced back to 750 and 650 BC. It is largely established by the ancient Greek Theocritus. During the 7th to 4th century, ancient Greek poetry overlapped the pastoral poetry. This literature took the forms of drama and romance during the 14th and 15th centuries. Some major poets of pastoralism: Hesiod, Theocritus, Virgil, and Christopher Marlowe. Some facts about Christopher Marlowe. He was born in Canterbury around February 26, 1564. He earned a bachelor's in arts in 1587. He was a playwright and a poet at the forefront of the 16th century. Marlowe's literary career lasted less than 6 years, but within those 6 years, his works influenced William Shakespeare and other generations of poets to follow. Here's a poem, The Passion Shepherd to His Love, by Christopher Marlowe.
Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that hills and valleys, dales and fields, or woods, or steepy mountain yields. And we will sit upon the rocks, and see the shepherds feed their flocks by shallow rivers, to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. And I will make thee beds of roses, and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cap of flowers, and a kirtle embroidered all with leaves of myrtle, a gown made of the finest wool, which from our pretty lambs we pull, fair lined slippers for the cold, with buckles of the purest gold, a belt of straw and ivy buds with coral clasps and amber studs. And if these pleasures may thee move, come, live with me, and be my love. The shepherd swains shall dance and sing for thy delight each May morning. If these delights thy mind may move, then live with me, and be my
In this poem, the speaker is a passionate shepherd who is trying to woo his lover, presumably a woman, to live with him in the countryside. The setting is in the countryside during springtime, which is also symbolic of new beginnings. It being a passionate poem, the version of the countryside life is a bit too good for real life. The speaker is feeling compelled to speak because he wants to share his feelings towards his woman and try to convince her to come live with him. This is set towards the end of the passion movement. Going more in depth with the poem consists of AABB patterns. The entire poem consists of 6 full-line stanzas. Speaking about the stanzas, stanza 1 and 2 is about the shepherd trying to convince his lover by persuading her with the perks of being in the relationship. He is using imagery to persuade his lover, trying to cast a vivid image upon his lover. He is using his passion of the countryside to express his love. In stanza 3 and 4, the shepherd is still trying to persuade his lover and with his passion. For example, using his own prized possession, or the sheep, to create a gown for her. This shows how interested he is in her. In the final 2 stanzas, stanza 5 and 6, he's asking if his persuasion has worked, and if so, to come live with him and be his love. And the poem ends right there. Thank you for watching.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Anderson, and I'm going to be talking about the Transcendentalism poetry movement. This movement began in the 1820s to late 1830s and continued through 1855. This movement took place in the eastern regions of the United States, and it was a reaction to the protest against the general state of spirituality. Transcendentalism is a literary and philosophical movement asserting the existence of an ideal spirituality reality that transcends the empirical and scientific and is known through intuition. It taught that divinity pervades all nature and humanity. Transcendentalists did not believe in a materialistic lifestyle. This poetry movement coincided with the Transcendentalism movement, which believed that society corrupted the purity of an individual. The members held a progressive view on feminism. They also supported movements like the anti-slavery and women's rights. Also, during this time period, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was in place. This act moved the slavery borders north of the Missouri border and gave the citizens the power to decide if the state would have slavery. Three major poets in this time period were Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is also known as the father of this poetry, Henry David Thoreau, who shared beliefs in transcendentalism and civil disobedience, and also Walt Whitman, who was most famous for his Book of Leaves. Emerson was a Harvard-educated man who believed everyone was naturally good and had limitless potential. The intellectual contributions of transcendentalism was inspired by the American idealism and spirit of reform. His poetry was based on the ideas of individuality, self-reliance, and freedom. Here is Emerson's poem, Fate.
Deep in the man sits fast his fate, to mold his fortunes, mean or great. Unknown to Cromwell as to me, was Cromwell's measure or degree. Unknown to him as to his horse, if he than his groom be better or worse. He works, plots, fights, in rude affairs, with squires, lords, kings, his craft compares. Till late he learned, through doubt and fear, broad England harbored not his peer. Obeying time, the last to own the genius from its cloudy throne. For the provision is allied unto the thing so signified. Or say, the foresight that awaits is the same genius that creates.
Emerson's poem explains that a person's life is fully controlled by fate or destiny, and supernatural forces or great beings controlled an individual's life for better or for worse. Emerson is describing how one's fate is controlled by supernatural forces, yet fails to mention that someone can become the master of their fate. In this poem, the target audience is speaking to anyone, because every person has fate, and according to Emerson, every person is naturally good until corrupted by society. The speaker seems to be someone of a higher power, because he kind of acts as if he knows how fate works and is telling the audience how one person's fate can end up. It explains,
in the man sits fast his fate, to mold his fortunes, mean or great. Unknown to Cromwell as to me, was Cromwell's measure or degree. Unknown to him as to his horse, if he than his groom be better or worse.
This shows how Emerson makes a clear point how fate cannot fully be understood by anyone or any living thing. Throughout Emerson's poem, he uses end rhyme, which is a rhyme that appears at the end of two or more lines of poetry. In every verse of this poem, the ending word rhymes with the verse above it.
Sophia Janney, and today I'll be explicating symbolist poetry, which was a movement that lasted from the 1870s to the 1900s. Symbolism originated in France and Belgium towards the end of the 19th century. It began with poetry, then spread to prose, painting, and theater. It opposed Impressionism and Realism and aimed to capture more absolute truths which could only be accessed through indirect methods. It used highly symbolized language portraying individual experience. In 1891, Albert Aurier defined symbolism as an aesthetic, describing it as a subjective vision expressed through non-naturalistic style. During this time period, France, Belgium, and the U.S. were under political reconstruction. The Napoleonic era in France had just ended, and France became a third republic that lasted until around the 1940s. Belgium had just gained independence from the Netherlands, and there was a rise of socialist political groups under the reign of Leopold II. Symbolism in France, Belgium, and the United States promoted nationalism in youth, labor activism, and revival of religious beliefs. In the U.S. during this time period was the Third Great Awakening. There was an extensive list of famous artists and poets from the symbolist era, from France, Belgium, and America. Here are 4 pieces of artwork painted by different artists during the symbolist era. Biblical references and Greek mythology were often pervasive themes in symbolist art, along with motifs of love, fear, anguish, death,
sexual awakening, and unrequited love. As you can see in Island of the Dead by Arnold Bauchlin, that's the theme of death, and love is in the First Communion by Eugene Carrier. Greek mythology is shown by Oedipus and the Sphinx by Gustave Moreau and Pandora by Odilon Fredon. Women were popular symbols appearing in both visual and literary sources of the 1880s during the symbolist movement, primarily appearing in two female types, the Virgin and Femme Fatale. I'll be focusing on Paul Verlaine, who is a symbolist poet that was born in 1844 and died in 1896. He was born in Metz, France, and was majorly influenced by the Parnasse movement and its leader Le Comte de Lisle. He first published a poem called La Revue du Progrès in 1863. As a young adult, he joined the 160th Battalion of the Garde Nationale for France. As an adult, he left his wife and got into an argument with a man and shot him twice. In jail was when he converted to Roman Catholicism. Although he died as an impoverished alcoholic, Verlaine was still deemed as one of the most popular symbolist poets of his time period. Many melodies have been composed about Verlaine's poetry. I'll be explicating Parisian Sketch by Paul Verlaine. The moon was shedding her plates of zinc in obtuse angles. The plumes of smoke, like fives distinct, rose thick and black from high roof tangles. The sky was gray, there wept a breeze, like a bassoon. Far off, a tomcat, stealthy, discreet, meowed, oh strangely out of tune. I walked, of divine Plato dreaming, and of Phidias, Salamis, Marathon, under twinkling eyes of blue jets of gas. This poem is free verse, which symbolists often use because they rejected constructed rhyming poetry techniques of the movements beforehand. There's a lot of personification, such as moon shedding her plates of zinc, there wept a breeze, under twinkling eyes of blue jets of gas. Also, lots of heavy descriptive words are utilized, like plates of zinc at obtuse angles when talking about the moonlight on the street, plumes of smoke, perhaps from the factories during the Industrial Revolution time period, and a tomcat, stealthy, discreet. When the speaker makes the observation that the plumes of smoke like fives distinct, it's relative to the number 5 symbolizing God's grace and goodness and favor towards humans in the Bible. There's also multiple references to Greek history and mythology, such as Plato, who was a Greek philosopher in 420s BC, Phidias, who sculpted the Parthenon in Greece, Salamis, who was a river nymph in Greek mythology, and the Marathon battle between the Athenian army and the Persian army in 490 BC. The speaker is walking through Paris at night, creating a mental sketch based on the observations he makes. He looks up towards the sky to look towards the stars, but the city is encased in smog because of the factory smoke, so he can't see. All he sees is blue jets of gas. Thanks for watching my symbolist movement presentation.
Decadent Poetry by Kristen Silicon. The definition of decadent poetry is that it was the art that should exist for its own sake, for the independence of moral and social concerns. In Latin, it means to fall down. The word was used by many critics with 3 different meanings. The Roman Empire used the word to describe the lack of strength and a decline of morals. The French used the word to dismiss writers who were unimportant to them, while the others used the word to take pride in their immortal work of literature. The decadent movement took place between 1860s to the 1900s. In 1804, the first usage of the word was used, art for art's sake. The decadent movement originated and ended in France, and it was born from the aesthetic movement and romanticism movement. The movement spread to other countries like England and the United States. Some characteristics of decadent poetry were that it was used to describe writers, used by critics, and it was an elaborate type of writing found in poetry, novels, and short fiction. Decadent authors wrote about many unpleasant and immoral topics, such as death, depression, and drugs.
Here goes. by Charles Baudelaire. Translated by Cyril Scott. Read for LibriVox.org by Andrew K. Waugh. In nature's temple, living columns rise, which oftentimes give tongue to words subdued, and man traverses this symbolic wood, which looks at him with half-familiar eyes, like lingering echoes, which are far confound, themselves in deep and sombre unity, as vast as night, and like transplendency, the scents and colours to each other respond. And scents there are, like infant's flesh as chaste, as sweet as oboes, and as meadows fair, and others proud, corrupted, rich and vast, which have the expansion of infinity, like amber, musk, and frankincense and myrrh, that sing the soul's and senses' ecstasy. End of poem.
The explication of the poem echoes with that. The Who was someone that took a step back from reality to see the deep connection between man and nature. The What was the speaker who was discussing how the man and nature were not alone in being depressed and mellow in the world, and that they are one, although everybody else is happy about the materialistic things of the world. It took place in a time when people have forgotten about the importance of nature, and it took place physically in an area of nature, but mentally in deep thought. It was written to inform the readers about the deep connect. The subject of the poem was man versus nature versus society. The theme was that nature and the man shared similar feelings about the world around them. The author uses personification to describe how the wood looks at the man with half-familiar eyes, found in line 4. The author also uses imagery, as he uses sight and smell to describe the way nature looks at man, and the scent of the infant's flesh as chaste, found in line 9.
Hey guys, Dylan Yancey here, and I'm here to teach you guys about Irish Renaissance poetry. A little bit of background on the Irish Renaissance. It is a part of literature sparked in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and it was really influenced by the Gaelic literary heritage. The literary movement was associated with a revival of the interest in the Ireland's early heritage and the growth of Irish nationalism from the middle of the 19th century, and the movement lasted several decades. Some famous Renaissance poets were George Sigerson. He was a physician, scientist, writer, politician, and poet. Rudyard Kipling. He was also a journalist, short story writer, poet, and novelist. Algernon Charles Swinburne was a poet, playwright, novelist, and critic. William Butler Yeats, who I will be choosing today as my poet, was a poet and author. William Butler Yeats was born in Dublin on June 13, 1865. He was one of 4 children and had 3 siblings, Jack, Elizabeth, and Lily. He went to school in Dublin and in London, and he was also the first Irishman to be awarded the Nobel Prize Award in Literature. The poem that I chose is An Irishman Foresees His Death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen, Kiltartans poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public man, nor cheering crowds, a lonely impulse of delight. Drove to this tumult in the clouds, I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. Explicating this poem, This poem was written in 1918, just after World War I. It was believed to be about a son of a friend of Yeats who died in World War I. The perspective is from that son of an Irishman airman before his death in the skies in an airplane. The first two lines are simple and straightforward. The airman is accepting his death calmly. Quotes, "I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above." From this we know the setting or where we are because he mentions among the clouds. So we know that we are in a plane of some sort. The third and fourth lines are careless. He mentions he does not hate the enemy nor loves his allies. Lines 11 and 12, a lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds, explain his reasoning for joining the fight. These two lines explain the reasoning for joining the fight. He loves to fly, so it is obviously his joy to just fly planes. Another quote, "The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind." With these two lines, it emphasizes the reflection of the airman that he is having on his life as he comes to his death. And the theme of the poem, I believe, is to be balanced. He does mention balance in the poem a couple times, and also realizing the balance of an airplane, to have it up in the air and completely balanced. And that should do it, guys. Hope you had fun. Have a good day.
Harlem Renaissance, 1920s to mid-1930s. The Harlem Renaissance was an artistic and literary movement kindling a new black cultural identity. The identity was summed up by Alan Locke, a teacher and critic, in 1926. It was mainly a literary movement, but it also included jazz. The publishing industry was funded by whites' fascination with the world of Harlem. A majority of the literature focused on portraying realistic black life, while some conservative black critics assumed the depiction would impede the cause of racial equality. Some of the major authors were Jean Toomer, an American poet and novelist; Langston Hughes, an American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and columnist; Wallace Thurman, an American novelist, editor, publisher, and wrote literary journals; as well as Zora Neale Hurston, an American novelist, short story writer, folklorist, and anthropologist. Langston Hughes was born February 1st, 1902. His parents divorced when he was a young child. He was raised by his grandmother until he was 13, and then he moved to live with his mother and her husband. After graduating high school, he spent a year in Mexico before attending Columbia University. He also traveled to Africa and Europe, working as a seaman during that time. In 1926, his first book, The Weary Blues, was published by Alfred A. Knopf. His first novel, Not Without Laughter, won a Harm Gold Medal for Literature. He died on May 22nd in 1967 at 20 East 127th Street in Harlem, that has since been renamed Langston Hughes Place.
I went down to the river. I sat down on the bank. I tried naked but couldn't, so I jumped in and sank. I came up once and hollered. I came up twice and cried. If that water hadn't been so cold, I would have sunk and died. But it was cold in that water. It was cold. I took the elevator, 16 floors above the ground. I thought about my baby, and I thought I would jump down. I stood there and I hollered. I stood there and I cried. If it hadn't been so high, I would have jumped and died. But it was high up there. It was high. So since I'm still here living, I guess I will live on. I could have died for love, but for living, I was born. Though you may hear me holler, and you may see me cry, I'll be honest, baby. You ain't gonna see me die. Life is fine. Fine as wine. Life is fine.
The speaker seems as if in everything he or she does they have thoughts of giving up, but there is always something to keep them going. The speaker also states that he or she will be dogged, my sweet baby, if you're going to see me die. He or she wouldn't make their love go through the pain of seeing the speaker's death. The speaker continuously talks of life and living. Life is the most important thing to the speaker. The poem is a BAB form, so every other two ending words rhyme. Hughes uses exclamation points to show importance. Readers are able to understand how the speaker felt at the moments where he or she realizes life is more important than death. Hughes's use of grammar and punctuation emphasizes the speaker's feelings about life.
Fireside poetry, from the mid-1800s to late 1800s. Fireside poets were a group of 19th century American poets from New England. They were the first group of American poets to rival the British poets. The name fireside poets is derived from their popularity and because their poetry was a common source of entertainment for families gathered around a fire. As a group, they are notable for their scholarship, political sensibilities, and their particular use of repetitive lines and controversial themes. These poets preferred normal, conventional forms of poetry over experimentation. They used standard forms, regular meters, and rhymed stanzas, which made their poems easily memorized. Fireside poets did not write for the sake of other poets. They wrote for the common person. They meant to have their stories told for families. They are most remembered for their longer narrative poems that frequently used American legends, mythology, and scenes of American home life as their primary subjects. 3 of the 5 famous fireside poets are William Bryant, John Witter, and Oliver Holmes. They are all famous for their individual works and their collaborated works. They all frequently used cultural and political issues within their poetry. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a commanding figure in the cultural life of 19th century America. Born in Maine in 1807, he became a national literary figure by the 1850s and a world-famous personality by the time of his death in 1882. He was a traveler, a linguist, and a romantic who identified with the great traditions of European literature and thought. At the same time, he was rooted in American life and history, which affected his poems' themes, and it made him ambitious for success. In his popular poems, he creates myths and epics such as The Song of the Hiawatha and Paul Revere's Ride.
Autumn Within by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It is autumn, not without, but within me is the cold youth and spring are all about. It is I that have grown old. Birds are darting through the air, singing, building without rest. Life is stirring everywhere, save within my lonely breast. There is silence, the dead leaves fall and rustle and are still. Beats no flail upon the sheaves, comes no murmur from the mill.
The speaker, which is also the poet, is speaking in first person, and it is an elderly person reminiscing his youth and comparing his feelings to the season of autumn. What is being discussed is the themes of old age and change. When this poem occurs is in autumn during the day, and it occurs in America. The speaker's motivation for writing is to write about his personal accounts of aging and change. The type of poem this poem is a lyrical poem, due to its emotion and personal feelings involved. The audience is majorly common people in America or in Europe. The title references to the themes and the meanings in this poem. Some themes in this poem are nature, life, and change. For example, he references to birds that sing and build without rest, but then contrasts it to himself, saying, "It is I that have grown old." The types of rhymes used in this poem are in rhymes in the pattern of ABAB. Some language used in this poem are metaphors, imagery, and symbols. One of the biggest literary concepts used in this poem is the use of a metaphor. Where the poem seems to be talking about autumn, it is really talking about the poet. The metaphor is accomplished through imagery and symbols. One example of imagery is in stanza 1, line 3, where the speaker says youth and spring are all about. One of the main symbols in this poem is nature. When the speaker uses words like spring, fall, and autumn, he conveys the theme of how change is inevitable.
Imagist poetry. Formulated around 1912 by Ezra Pound, in conjunction with fellow poets Hilda Doolittle, Richard Aldington, and F.S. Flint. Imagist poetry consisted of mostly young poets working in England and America in the early 20th century. They rejected Romantic and Victorian conventions and favored precise imagery in clear, non-elevate language. Other Imagist poets include John Gould Fletcher, Harriet Monroe, Conrad Aiken, Marianne Moore, Wallace Stevens, D.H. Lawrence, and T.S. Eliot. This form of poetry was inspired by the critical views of T.E. Hume. The style was in revolt against the careless thinking and romantic optimism he saw prevailing. It was a successor to the French symbolist movement and sought analogy with sculpture. From an Imagist manifesto. Number 1. To use the language of common speech, but to employ the exact word, not the nearly exact nor the merely decorative word. Number 2. We believe that the individuality of a poet may often be better expressed in free verse than in conventional forms. In poetry, a new cadence means a new idea. Number 3. Absolute freedom in the choice of subject. Number 4. To present an image. We are not a school of painters, but we believe that poetry should render particulars exactly and not deal in vague generalities, however magnificent and sonorous. It is for this reason that we oppose the cosmic poet, who seems to us to shrink the real difficulties of his art. Number 5. To produce a poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred nor indefinite. Number 6. Finally, most of us believe that concentration is of the very essence of poetry. The tree has entered my hands, the sap has ascended my arms. The tree has grown in my breast, downward. The branches grow out of me like arms. Tree you are, moss you are. You are violets with wind above them. A child, so high you are. And all this is folly to the world. Ezra Pound. This poem has an allusion that is based heavily in Greek mythology. The traditional myth is that Apollo insulted Eros, saying he was not worthy of his bow and arrow. Eros then shot Apollo with an arrow to prompt his love, and then shot the nymph Daphne with an arrow to make her feel hatred towards him. Apollo fell in love with Daphne and continuously followed her, and she hated him. Finally, Eros decided to help Apollo catch Daphne, but she begged her father, Peneus, to change her into something else. He agreed and transformed Daphne into a tree. The first 5 lines are written from the perspective of Daphne, describing her transformation. The last 5 lines are from the perspective of an onlooker, and talks about Daphne's foolishness.
Objectivist Poetry by Jolie Luter. Objectivism was founded by novelist, screenwriter, and philosopher Ayn Rand. This movement began informally in the 1950s due to a group of people coming together based on their advocacy of individualism and their mutual interest of Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, which was based on an objectivist approach. Objectivism rejects a false alternative world and represents a fully secular and absolutist view. It is neither liberal nor conservative, but recognizes a moral principles and a fully free, civilized society. Objectivism shows virtues of rational self-interest, virtues such as independent thinking, productiveness, justice, honesty, and self-responsibility. Three major objectivist poets include Charles Reznikoff, who is an American poet best known for his work Recitative, Karl Rakowski, famous work is The City, and George Oppen, whose famous work is The Leviathan. George Oppen was an American poet who is known as one of the best and most chief components of objectivism. Him, including William Carlos, Louis Zukofsky, Charles Reznikoff, set up the Objectivist Press. This press published Oppen's first book called Discrete Series.
Truth also, the pursuit of it, like happiness, and it will not stand. Even the verse begins to eat away in the acid. Pursuit, pursuit. The wind moves a little, moving in a circle, very cold. How shall we say, in ordinary discourse? We must talk now. I am no longer sure of the words, the clockwork of the world. What is inexplicable is the preponderance of objects. The skylights, daily with that predominance, and we have become the present. We must talk now. Fear is fear, but we abandon one another.
The title Leviathan addresses the all-consuming force of mankind's own actions, which George Oppen felt these actions posed a threat to human survival. The speaker is speaking of pursuit and happiness, and pursuing that of truth that is not static. The audience is those who feel impossibility in communicating. The theme of Leviathan is communication, in which subject is communicating to understand objects in the present moment.
My name's Connor, and today we'll be talking about confessional poetry. Confessional poetry is the poetry of personal or I. This style really emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The style deals with private experiences like death, trauma, depression, and relationships. Subjects like drug abuse, alcoholism, suicide, and depression were typically considered shameful or embarrassing, but in this type of poetry they're discussed openly. Now, these type of poems are generally written in the first-person view that allows readers to delve closely into the thoughts and feelings of the author. Some of the major poets from this time are Robert Lau, and he's best known for his volume Life Studies. He studied poetry at Kenyon College and started writing confessional poetry in the late 1950s. John Berryman is another big one, and he's best known for the Dream Songs. He was a professor at a college as well as a poet, and he struggled with alcoholism and depression. Now, Anne Sexton also suffered from postpartum depression, and she was actually encouraged by her doctor to write as a treatment. She joined Boston writing groups in the late 1950s. Anger, as black as a hook, overtakes me. Each day, each Nazi took at 8 a.m. a baby and sautéed him for breakfast in his frying pan. And death looks on with a casual eye and picks at the dirt under his fingernail. Man is evil, I say aloud. Man is a flower that should be burnt, I say aloud. Man is a bird full of mud, I say aloud. And death looks on with a casual eye and scratches his anus. Man with his small pink toes, with his miraculous fingers, is not a temple, but an outhouse, I say aloud. Let man never again raise his teacup. Let man never again write a book. Let man never again put on his shoe. Let man never again raise his eyes on a soft July night. Never, 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 never. I say those things aloud. I beg the Lord not to hear. The subject of this poem is how cruel human beings can be, especially to each other, and the theme of the poem is anger and hatred. In the poem, it's a woman discussing how cruel man is, and she really shows this by how she says how man is evil and how he is a flower that should be burned. This poem is in the view of a woman after World War II, as she discusses her view of man after all the terrible things she has witnessed while in the concentration camps.
My name is Sydney Slzinski, and I will be talking to you about the New York School of Poetry. So this is a movement that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s in New York City. And not only did this movement include poets, but it also included musicians, dancers, and other types of artists. These people were very abstract in their expressions. They believed in something called stream of consciousness writing, which is basically where you just write whatever you think without much revision. Their work included a lot of vivid imagery, and they were heavily inspired by surrealism, in particular French surrealists. And the New York School movement was a reaction to the plain, violent, and rigid confessionalist movement that the New York School poets hated and wanted to be completely opposite of. So some of the major poets that were included in the New York School of Poetry were Frank O'Hara, and he was born in 1926 and died in 1966, and he was considered the leader of the movement, and he took the name the New York School from other artists and musicians and just expanded it to poetry. John Ashbery was another major poet of the time. He was born in 1927 and is still alive today, and he was a very self-reflective, and he used lots of allusions in his poetry, and he is credited for winning almost every major American poetry award ever made. Barbara Guest is another major poet, and she was born in 1920 and died recently in 2006. And she not only wrote poems, but also had numerous paintings in different magazines, and she wrote poems to narrate her own paintings. There were 14 poets that were considered to be true New York-style poets, although there were other poets that had similar writing styles. All of the New York School poets were very liberal in their views. 13 out of 14 of them attended Harvard University. 13 out of 14 of them were homosexual. 13 out of 14 of them served in the military. Almost all of them reviewed some kind of art, whether it was paintings, drawings, sculptings, music, dance, and most of them were also New York natives. This poem, Homosexuality, was written by the leader of the New York School, Frank O'Hara. So we are taking off our masks, are we, and keeping our mouths shut, as if we've been pierced by a glance. The song of an old cow is not more full of judgment than the vapors which escape one's soul when one is sick. So I pull the shadows around me like a puff, and crinkle my eyes, as if at the most exquisite moment of a very long opera, and then we are off, without reproach and without hope that our delicate feet will touch the earth again, let alone very soon. It is the law of my own voice I shall investigate. I start like ice, my finger to my ear to my heart, that proud cur at the garbage can in the rain. It's wonderful to admire oneself with complete candor, tallying up the merits of each of the latrines. 14th Street is drunken and credulous. 53rd tries to tremble, but is too at rest. The good love, a park, and the inept a railway station. And there are the divine ones who will drag themselves up and down the lengthening shadow of an Abyssinian head in the dust, trilling their long, elegant heels of hot air, crying to confuse the brave. It is a summer day, and I want to be wanted more than anything else in this world. So, the who in this poem is a homosexual man, possibly Frank O'Hara, reflecting about his own life experiences and what it is like to be judged for being gay. The what, he is talking about his experiences and thoughts about coming out to the world and not hiding behind who he truly is. The when, he is expressing his feelings during the prime of his life, and he is very deep in his thoughts. He possibly could have written this to bring awareness to the discrimination of homosexuals and the want and need for equality across the board. The subject of this poem is homosexuality. The theme is acceptance of yourself and for others, and the idea of self-exploration. Also, it touches on longing to be able to be your true authentic self and not having to hide behind something that you're not, and being able to show the world who you really are. It's organized in couplets, however they do not rhyme. Some symbols in this poem include summer, which is a symbol for the prime of life. The masks he mentioned in the first couplet symbolize the act of hiding behind who he really is and pretending to be someone he is not. When he talks about the old cow's opinion, he could be referring to how old people come from a different and less accepting generation, so they might have a very harsh view on homosexuality. His reference to sickness: during the 1950s and 1960s, homosexuality was considered to be a mental illness, and it wasn't until 1975 that it was lifted. When he says finger to ear, ear to heart, he is symbolizing that he listens to how he feels, he thinks about it, and then he lets his heart guide him in the direction that he thinks he should go in. The reference to 14th Street and 53rd Avenue is where one of the very first gay rights protests was held in New York, and it was a big moment in history.
Guys, my name is Devin England, and today I will be talking about Black Mountain poetry. So first let's start with history of the college. Black Mountain College started in 1933 and was mainly created to conduct an educational experiment that lasted until 1956. The school was considered one of the first to stress the importance of the arts, as well as the belief that the arts are needed in human understanding. The college also had many guest speakers such as Albert Einstein, Clement Greenberg, and William Carlos Williams. What was so special about this college? Well, it was a very self-sufficient college. All residents, teachers, and students would help clean the campus, as well as all food supply was mainly the college's farm. So let's talk about the origins of the poetry. Black Mountain poetry came about in 1950 after Charles Olson, a professor at the college, wrote a very influential essay titled Projective Verse, which kick-started the idea of Black Mountain poetry. He was most definitely the founder, as after the paper was written, the people wrote through his way of thinking about art. These are just some examples of the artworks of the college at the time, and there was lots of water painting. So let's talk about the politics of the college. At the time, racism was still a normal occurrence, as the time period was the 1930s to the 1950s. Though oddly enough, there was no issues at the college. They wanted all with the special talent for the art, as even intellectual Jewish people escaping the Nazis were accepted. So let's talk about one of the leading poets at Black Mountain College, named Robert Creeley. Now, Robert Creeley was born on May 21st, 1926 in Arlington, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard University from 1943 to 1946. He published his first poem in the Harvard magazine titled Wake. Soon after, in 1949, he began corresponding with some of the Black Mountain College residents, such as Urza Pound and William Carlos Williams. Then, soon after, started working there. This is just a good picture of Robert Creeley at Black Mountain College. I will be reading you one of Robert Creeley's poems titled The Love of a Woman. The love of a woman is the possibility which surrounds her as hair her head, as the love of her follows and describes her. But what if they die? Then there is still the aura, left sadly, but hover in the air. Surely, where this had taken place? Then sing of her, of whom it will be said, he sang of her, it was the song he made which made her happy, so she lived. So let's break this poem down. The husband or man of the situation seems to be the speaker. The subject is how powerful a woman's love is, and the time seems to be after the woman has left his life, possibly death or a breakup, The speaker is most likely informing the audience of how amazing woman's love is, whether to not toy with her emotion or cherish it. I believe this poem was intended for fellow poets, as well as men of the generation, to inform them of how important a woman is in their life. The subject is a woman in this man's life, and the theme would be how important and amazing a woman's love is. There was lots of visual imagery in this poem, as well as simile. That would be the end of this presentation. Thanks for watching.
Language Poetry by Alex Salt. Language poetry is an American poetry that emerged in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. It emphasizes the importance of the reader to bring out the meaning of the poem. The language poets are an avant-garde group, meaning that they try new things and think outside the box when writing. Famous language poets include Charles Bernstein, Bob Perelman, and Leslie Scalpino. All the Whiskey in Heaven by Charles Bernstein is the poem I chose to explicate.
All the whiskey in heaven. Not for all the whiskey in heaven. Not for all the flies in Vermont. Not for all the tears in the basement. Not for a million trips to Mars. Not if you paid me in diamonds. Not if you paid me in pearls. Not if you gave me your pinky ring. Not if you gave me your curls. Not for all the fire in hell. Not for all the blue in the sky. Not for an empire of my own. Not even for peace of mind. No, never. I'll never stop loving you. Not till my heart beats its last. And even then, in my words and my songs, I would love you all over again.
Explication. The speaker is a man who is deeply in love. Throughout the story, he expresses his love to a woman. The speaker seems to be in Vermont, and the speaker expresses his love to a woman after a tragedy. The speaker feels the need to express his love to give the woman motivation and show how much he cares about her. The form of the poem is a sonnet. The rhythm follows a gazelle and an in-rhyme. The meter is an anaphora, meaning each line starts the same way. Not for all and not a few are both repeated multiple times throughout the poem. The subject is love, and the themes are loneliness, love, and devotion. Symbols include fire, which represents hell and darker times, tears, which represents loss and mourning, and fall, which represents the decline and the approach of death. In conclusion, language poetry is only given meaning when read in a certain way, just like all the whiskey in heaven.
New Formalist Poetry by Kristen Smith. New Formalist poetry is a form of American poetry from the late 20th century. It is a traditional form of verse that was created in response to the free verse poetry of the 1960s and 1970s. New Formalist poets include Richard Wilbur, Mark Jarman, and Robert Frost.
Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain, and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat, and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still, and stopped the sound of feet, when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, O luminary clock against the sky, proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night.
The speaker of the poem is a man who is dealing with depression alone. The plot describes a man walking alone at night, thinking about himself, his depression, and society. The poem takes place in a dark, empty city in England, late at night while it's raining. The speaker is writing this to describe his journey with depression, as well as the society around him through symbols of the dark night. Acquainted with the Night is a sonnet with the rhyme scheme of terza rima and a meter of iambic pentameter. Frost writes with repetition when he begins lines 1 through 5, 7, and 14 with I have. He uses personification when giving the clock in the city human characteristics, saying, "The watchman on his beat," and proclaim the time. The themes of Acquainted with the Night include isolation as well as man versus himself versus society when he describes his journey with his illness and the city around him. Acquainted with the Night is filled with symbolism. The symbols of darkness and lightness symbolize his sadness, depression, and the society around him that is not dealing with these things. The symbol of isolation signifies the speaker's loneliness in the world, like when he says, "Outwalk the furthest city light," and "but not to call me back or say goodbye," showing that no one cared for him or was there for him. In conclusion, new formalist poems, like Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost, have a traditional structure, but are still filled with themes and symbols.
Elegy, a 20th century poetic form, by Jessica Brummett. Elegies came around in the 20th century. The elegy began as a poetic Greek metrical form and is traditionally written in response to the death of a person or a group. An elegy is a form of literature that can be defined as a poem or song in the form of elegiac couplets. Poets usually phrase their thoughts imaginatively in the first person. The genre is usually death. Typically, they are written in honor of someone who is deceased or to mourn the death of an individual. Usually, the author or speaker associates the events of the deceased with events in their own life. The poems follow 3 stages. In the beginning, there is some sort of expression of grief and sorrow. Towards the middle of the poem, the author begins to praise and honor our dead. And finally, there's consolation at the end, or comfort to ease the pain. Elegies are not always based on a plot. 3 key elegiac poets include W. H. Auden, who has had a huge influence on elegiac poetry in the 20th century. He's seen in the top right. Paul Celan, as seen in the middle, who wrote Fugue of Death, written for the victims of the Holocaust, and Seamus Heaney, who is widely recognized as one of the major poets in the 20th century. His most famous poem is titled Digging, about his dying father. He is seen in the bottom right. W. H. Auden, or Wyson Hugh Auden, was born on February 21, 1907, in the United Kingdom. He is known for his ability to write poems in almost every verse form. A few of his most famous and well-known elegies include Funeral Blues and In Memory of W. B. Yeats. In his time, he wrote many elegies about inspirational and famous people that passed away. For an example, his poem titled In Memory of W. B. Yeats was written soon after one of the most famous poets in the 20th century passed away. He also wrote a poem titled Elegy for JFK soon after JFK passed away.
Stop all the clocks. Cut off the telephone. Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos, and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come.
Let aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, he is dead. Put crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves.
He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong.
The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good.
The title, Funeral Blues, means exactly what it says. The poem has a very sad or blue mood, and it is about a person dying. Therefore, the title, Funeral Blues, fits perfectly. The speaker is clearly speaking from weakness. They are sensible towards death, and he or she speaks as if sadness or sorrow has changed the way they view the world around them. The audience are those who have recently lost someone in their life. The poem is directed towards people who can relate to the pain of losing someone who is close and dear to their heart. The subject of the elegy is the emotion that is felt right after a death. The theme is death, sorrow, and sadness. The author uses silence and darkness to symbolize the feeling of sorrow. For example, he says, "Silence the piano," or "The stars are not wanted now. Put everyone out. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun." In these quotes, he describes the world as being silent and dark, to put a picture in the audience's mind of what the speaker's sadness looks like. The pattern of this elegy is AABB.
Madison Bush, and I will be discussing the jazz poetry era. In the 1920s, music and poetry collided and created jazz poetry. It immediately became a popular form of expressing yourself. Jazz poetry is a literary genre defined as poetry necessarily informed by jazz music. That is, poetry in which the poet responds to and writes about jazz. Jazz poetry, like the music itself, encompasses a variety of forms, rhythms, and sounds. During the rise of this genre of poetry, the Harlem Renaissance was taking off. Starting in the 1920s through 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance was a period filled with creative and artistic motives, shown through writing or art. The motivators who started this movement were Langston Hughes, Rudolph Fisher, Wallace Thurman, Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Nella Larsen, and more. The Renaissance focused mainly on the lives of African American people, what their life was like, their living conditions, and their concerns or thoughts about equality. African Americans expressed their personal stories or feelings through the jazz poetry. Kenneth Rexroth was born on December 22nd in 1905 in South Bend, Indiana. He began publishing in magazines at the age of 15. He laid the groundwork for what later became known as the San Francisco Renaissance. He was introduced to a more musical method and then performed his poems with jazz musicians. His famous poem is called Giktahar. Yusef Komunyakaa was born April 29th in 1941 in Bogalusa, LA. He was a scholar, professor, and prize-winning poet. His poems are related to his life. Because his poems are related to his life, he tends to write in a jazz style. One of his famous poems is called After Summer Fell Apart. Langston Hughes was born on February 1st in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. He was first recognized as an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He recorded the nuances of the Black life and the frustrations that occurred. Because of this, he got into jazz poetry. One of his famous poems is called The Ballad of the Landlord.
Ballad of the Landlord. Landlord, landlord, my roof has sprung a leak. Don't you remember I told you about it way last week? Landlord, landlord, these steps is broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down. $10 you say I owe you? $10 you say is due? Well, that's $10 more than I'll pay you till you fix this house up new. What? You gonna get eviction orders? You gonna cut off my heat? You gonna take my furniture and throw it in the street? You talking high and mighty. Talk on till you get through. You ain't gonna be able to say a word if I land my fist on you. Police! Police! Come and get this man. He's trying to ruin the government and overturn the land. Copper's whistle, patrol bell, arrest. Precinct station, iron cell, headlines in press. Man threatens landlord. Tenant held no bail. Judge gives Negro 90 days in county jail.
The type of poem is a ballad. The poem is about a man who is having a difficult time paying his rent, and his landlord is demanding money. The speaker has asked his landlord to help fix the problems with his house, but the landlord has ignored his request. The speaker feels that his landlord is the criminal, but if the justice system was involved, it would be his fault. The speaker also feels that there is no constitutional justification in his condition. While reading this poem, you can imagine the man complaining about his landlord, and you can hear the noises of some specific words. For example, patrol bell, arrest, precinct station, iron cell, lines 25 through 29. In this stanza, you can imagine the patrol bell ringing and the iron cell closing. In this poem, the speaker is a middle-aged man. His voice sounds rough and exhausted. He's speaking to his landlord. He is complaining about having to pay $10 for rent when his house is falling apart and the landlord will not do anything about it. This is taking place somewhere in the United States, Harlem, New York, and the time period is the 1920s through 1930s. The motivation for the speaker to speak about this is because he believes that it is a problem and the situation is unfair and needs to be talked about. The subject is rent/landlord, and the theme is struggle in society. In 1929, the Great Depression began and the jazz poetry era ended. After the stock market crash of October in 1929, the people of Wall Street were in trouble. Millions of investors were now wiped of much of their money. The banks had failed and the money had been used up. The unemployment rate for American workers had increased. 13 to 15 million workers became unemployed. After many years of the ongoing depressed states, the Great Depression finally ended in 1939 when World War II became the new topic to handle.
Hi, this is Mojda Eftikari, and in this video, I'll be talking about the slam poetry.
Slam poetry, also known as the spoken word poetry, is a movement which became popular in the 1990s. Slam poetry places an emphasis on the performance element of poetry, rather than just the content. Many slam poets address racial, economic, and gender inequalities as well as current events. Slam poetry is performed at competitions called poetry slams. At a slam, a poet will perform alone or with a team for an audience. Slam poetry can be similar to hip-hop music or may use an unrhyming narrative. Some poets enhance their performances by changing voices and tones, while others sing parts of the poem. Some poets use nothing but their words, while others include tap dancing, beatboxing, and choreographed movements. American poet Mark Smith is credited with starting the Poetry Slam at the Get Me High Lounge in Chicago in November 1984. In July 1986, the slam moved to its permanent home, the Green Mill Jazz Club. In August 1988, the first Poetry Slam was held in New York City and hosted by Bob Holman. In 1990, the first National Poetry Slam took place in Fort Mason, San Francisco, involving a team from Chicago, a team from San Francisco, and an individual poet from New York. Soon afterward, Poetry Slam had become so popular that poets were able to make full-time careers in performance and competition, touring around the country and eventually the world. As of 2016, the National Poetry Slam featured 72 certified teams, culminating in 5 days of competition. Today, there are Poetry Slam competitions in an ever-expanding array of nations around the globe. Poetry Slam Incorporation sanctions 3 major annual poetry competitions on a national and international scale. Some of the most famous slam poets are Mark Smith, Patricia Smith, and Taylor Mali. Mark Smith is an American poet and the creator and founder of the Poetry Slam movement. Smith was born in 1949 and grew up on the southeast side of Chicago. He graduated from James Bowen High School and spent most of his young life as a construction worker, but has written poetry since he was 19. Mark Smith is best known for bringing to the worldwide poetry community a new style of poetic presentation that has spawned the most important social and literary arts movements of our time. Patricia Smith is an American poet, spoken word performer, playwright, author, writing teacher, and former journalist. She is a four-time individual National Poetry Slam champion and appeared in the 1996 documentary Slam Nation, which followed various poetry slam teams as they competed at the 1996 National Poetry Slam in Portland. Taylor Mali is an American slam poet, humorist, teacher, and voice-over artist. Taylor Mali graduated from the Collegiate School, a private school for boys, in 1983. He received a BA in English in 1987 and a master's in English and creative writing from Kansas State University in 1993. As a slam poetry performer, Taylor Mali has been on 7 National Poetry Slam teams, which of those 6 appeared on the final stage and 4 won the competition. For this video, I have chosen the poem What Teachers Make by Taylor Mali.
He says the problem with teachers is what's a kid going to learn from someone who decided his best option in life is to become a teacher? He reminds the other dinner guests that it's true what they say about teachers, that those who can do, and those who can't teach. I decide to bite my tongue instead of his and resist the urge to remind the other dinner guests that it's also true what they say about lawyers. Because we're eating, after all, and this is polite conversation. I mean, you're a teacher, Taylor. Be honest. What do you make? And I wish he hadn't done that. Asked me to be honest, because you see, I have a policy about honesty and ass-kicking, which is, if you ask for it, then I have to let you have it. You want to know what I make? I make kids work harder than they ever thought they could. I can make a C+ feel like a Congressional Medal of Honor, and I can make an A- feel like a slap in the face. How dare you waste my time with anything less than your very best? You want to know what I make? I make kids sit through 40 minutes of study hall in absolute silence. No, you cannot work in groups. No, you can't ask a question, so put your hand down. Why won't I let you go to the bathroom? Because you're bored and you don't really have to go, do you? You want to know what I make? I make parents tremble in fear when I call home at around dinner time. Hi, this is Mr. Mali. I haven't called at a bad time. I just wanted to talk to you about something that your son did today. He said, leave the kid alone. I still cry sometimes, don't you? And it was the noblest act of courage that I have ever seen. I make parents see their children for who they are and who they can be. You want to know what I make? I make kids question. I make them criticize. I make them apologize and mean it. I make them write, and then I make them read. I make them spell definitely beautiful, definitely beautiful, definitely beautiful, over and over again until they will never misspell either one of those words again. I make them show all their work in math and then hide it on their final drafts in English. I make them realize that if you got this, then you follow this. And if somebody tries to judge you based on what you make, you give them this. Let me break it down for you so you know what I say is true. I make a goddamn difference. Now what about you?
In his poem, What Teachers Make, Taylor Mali asserts that, despite the people who don't value the worth of a teacher as much as they should, teachers are the foundation on which the society stands on. Mali supports this assertion by exemplifying what teachers make and do, narrating multiple interactions that he has with his students and their parents, and through chronologically going through process analysis to show the difference teachers make with their students over time. Molly's purpose is to tell a story through slam poetry in order to make his audience question the stereotypes that some people make about teachers. Molly uses pathos as he speaks to his audience during his slam poetry performance. Although his poem doesn't have a specific rhyme, Molly uses repetition to put emphasis on some parts of his poem. Such example would be, I make them write, and then read. The subject of his poem is that teachers can make a difference in the world, and the theme is that you should follow your heart and use your talents in order to do what you like, and you should never think that life is about making money, but rather about making a difference in other people's life.
Thank you so much for watching.
21st century poetry. Throughout history, there have been hundreds of major and minor poetic movements. The 21st century movement brought interesting developments in imagery, rhetoric, and subject matter. There are many different forms of 21st century poetry. These include visual poetry, ads and mass media, performance poetry, song lyrics, node poems, and synthetic poems. Visual poetry is typically non-rhyming. It has a varied structure and beat. Visual poetry uses the page as a canvas to visually represent themes, subjects, or sentiments of words in a variety of shapes and forms. Themes include artistic, nature, seasons, and relationships. Believe it or not, ads and mass media are considered poetry. They have a varied rhyme, and they are principally a single line, slogan, or rhyming couplet. It is a varied beat, and it uses catchy lines, phrases, stanzas, and attention grabbers to quickly capture the senses and mind of customers. It is embedded with the universal truth, and themes include commercial, cultural, love, and human interest. Performance poetry has a varied rhyme and varied structure. Some rely on improv. Performance poets challenge themselves to choose their language to innovate rhythmic and structures. Poets use stage as the page, transforming poetry readings into theatrical events. Themes include social and political critique. Song lyrics are also another form of poetry. They have varied rhyme schemes and varied structure. They are primarily an iambic trimeter, tetrameter, or pentameter. Words are written to accompany music or instruments, and a poem or lyric tells a story using concrete images. Themes include love, tragedy, happiness, loss, life, and issues. Synthetic poems are dedicated to questioning and highlighting material processes of creating poetry. Rhyme is possible and structure is constant, but not necessarily mandated by syllables or metrics. Synthetic poetry often relies on other structural devices. Beats are possible, but they resist themes and encourage readers to experience and partake in innovative uses of language. Node poems use an interactive online interface to make readers actively participate in exploring and constructing poetry. They have varied rhyme, shorter lines, and varied beat. They incorporate universal themes, and they create a graphic representation of a poem. Maya Angelou, Rita Dove, and Gwendolyn Brooks were three very well-known poets at the turn of the 21st century. Flirtation is a poem written by Rita Dove. After all, there's no need to say anything. At first, an orange peeled and quartered flares, like a tulip on a Wedgwood plate. Anything can happen. Outside the sun has rolled up her rugs, and night strewn salt across the sky. My heart. This poem doesn't really have any natural sound or rhythm to it, and the way the words are set up leaves a passionate meaning behind the poem. This makes an emphasis on the subject without the use of a sound device. This is a free verse poem, and it doesn't have a consistent meter. Each of the lines has a different number of syllables. Vivid imagery of nature is used to define the action of flirting. Dove describes an orange peeled and quartered as a visual for a new attraction between two individuals. The hope for a potential relationship is expressed as a tulip that will naturally flare up. This is what is being dramatized in the poem. The tone for this poem is romantic and optimistic, and the theme is flirting with someone or seeking interest in someone.